met Jennifer 7 years ago, and we just happened to like cross paths. I was doing something for foster kids, and I had told my story, and they had connected with me. I became an ambassador after Jennifer and her co-founder, Jessica, were looking to start an organization to connect foster youth with their families. So that was huge for me. I was like, oh my God, that would be really great. But not necessarily like close family, not like a grandmother or a first cousin or, anything like that, or auntie, like more distant. So Jennifer is a nuclear scientist, by the way. That's a rocket scientist. She is super smart. I love that. She went to West Point, graduated from West Point, and like I really can't say that much. I want her to tell the story about how we really met, because she tells it better. But this is Jennifer Jacobs with Connect Our Kids.
Thank you, Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, I am an Army veteran and a nuclear engineer, and I'm a physicist by training. I've spent most of my career working to counter nuclear terrorism. So of course, that makes sense that I'm here today to talk to you about child welfare. I'll talk about how Lisa and I met and kind of how that story fits into it, because it's actually at the DC Rotary that I first met Lisa in person. We talked previously, and that was a big piece of what led to Connect Our Kids being founded. But before that, 12 years ago, I was still focused on countering nuclear trafficking and nuclear material floating around the globe. And I happened to read a Time magazine article that was focused on foster care. They had a whole spread that week around foster care, what it's a little bit of context, what it's like, and what happens when children age out of foster care. Some of the things that are articles about foster care are often very difficult and frustrating to read, because they talk about everything that's broken in foster care, which is a lot. This article was a little different in that it mainly was trying to talk about something that was working. And so what it was talking about that was working was this process of, instead of hoping and praying that a couple interested in adopting might come in, and instead of adopting a baby, they would somehow be convinced to adopt a angry teenager. And that might happen from time to time, but it's certainly not scalable. And it certainly doesn't work for the 20,000 young people who age out of foster care every year, never having found that forever family that they had been promised. And so this article talked about something child welfare professionals do to turn that dynamic on its head. Instead of trying to recruit more stranger adoptive families, which can be wonderful families, but there's not enough, and it's not necessarily the right solution for a given child. Instead, flip that on its head and go from the child or the youth out. Who are all of their people? Who are the people that already know and love them? Who are the people who could know and love them? Who are the people who haven't been asked to be part of their team? And the article highlighted an organization in St. Louis that does this. There's a number of them around the country. And they have found that if they can locate 150 to 200 adults in a child's network, whether or not they even know that child exists. So it could be third cousins, great uncles, neighbors, teachers, coaches, everyone in that child's universe. They can find 150, 200 of those folks. Statistically, one of them at least will step up and become a permanent parent figure to that child. Whether it results in a formal adoption or a guardianship or just a long lifetime support to that child as a parent-like role, there will be someone. The question is not whether. The question is not whether that person will be there to be found. The question is, does the child welfare professional have the resources and the bandwidth to keep pursuing that effort long enough? Because sometimes it's 50 people, sometimes it's 150, sometimes it's 600. So obviously can vary. I found this fascinating because, one, it made a lot more sense to me than the kind of hoping and praying for miracles approach. Two, I already knew a place where this was done and done on a massive scale, and that was the intelligence system. The intel system in this country does exactly what I just described for terrorists. So they take a terrorist or a terrorist group and they build out a network around that terrorist of the terrorist known connections, relatives, friends, acquaintances and contacts, possible colleagues. And they build out a visual map of this that manages all of the massive data that would go into that. Because a human brain, no matter how smart, cannot handle that amount of data, especially not for multiple subjects. And of course, the intelligence field, being our intelligence field, is well funded and has a multi-million-dollar piece of government-built software to help do this work. And I had seen this software and drooled over it for years because I'm a data person and a scientist, and I love that kind of stuff. And I would see it in briefings, but I never got to actually touch it myself. But I could see how it worked and I understood it. And when I read this article in Time magazine about how foster care professionals were doing the same kind of work, I thought, oh my God, they must be using Analyst Notebook, the name of the software, or they must have their own version of it. I got to know what that is. So I called them up and I said, I read the article about you in Time magazine, and this is so amazing. You've solved foster care. I assume you're getting so many phone calls from everywhere. I'm so glad you answered my phone call. And I just wondering, how are you scaling this? Because every child in foster care needs to be served this way. If a child goes into foster care, everyone who could help needs to be contacted and notified and brought into the fold, and whatever they have to offer needs to be taken advantage of. How are you doing that? Are you using Analyst Notebook? And I can hear some laughter. So you all are more knowledgeable than I was at the time about child welfare. And they said, who are you again? And I said, well, I'm Dr. Jennifer Jacobs, and but I'm just an interested party at this one. They said, who do you work for? Who are you with? I said, well, I'm with Homeland Security, but that's not really relevant. And they said, why is Homeland Security calling us? So there was some confusion there. But in the end, they told me that they not only never heard of Analyst Notebook, of course, but they didn't even understand what I meant by using technology to scale this approach. When I said, are you using technology? They said, well, we use Google and stuff. We're not cave people. Well, of course we use technology. I said, no, I mean how Facebook knows who you know. Isn't that kind of creepy? But also if Facebook knows who you know, shouldn't Facebook and LinkedIn and shouldn't the internet know who these foster kids would know? Who would know them? Shouldn't that work be getting pushed to you just like Facebook tries to make you reach out to everybody you've ever met and be friends with them? Why isn't that happening for you? And they said, we don't follow. Because what I learned is social workers are amazing people, very smart, very capable, but they don't have time to be deep down into the tech world and wondering how Facebook knows who they know. They are overwhelmed with trying to keep these kids having a place to sleep, trying to do what they can to heal what's happened to them and their families and all the other things they're asked to do. So they said, no, we use Post-it notes and Excel spreadsheets for those who are comfortable with Excel. Those who are not, they use Word. Obviously, that's not scalable. And so I realized from that conversation and then subsequent conversations, they were polite enough to keep answering the phone when I called, even though they continued to be thoroughly confused for years about why I was calling them. While the Intel space has this multi-million-dollar software that we taxpayers have provided for the very good purpose that the intelligence space uses it for, to keep us safe, we have not provided anything remotely equivalent to the foster care space, where 500,000 children every year are taken from their families for various reasons and left, for the most part, to the luck of the draw. And that's not right. I was pregnant with our third child when I started this journey. So you can imagine that my attention to parenting and the needs of children was particularly acute. And so it kind of hit me very deeply what it might be like for a child to have to go through this process. And I'll certainly never understand what it's really like for that. Lisa and her other lived experience alumni have many stories that they can tell. But I understood enough to understand that this was not something I would ever want my children or any child I loved or cared about at all to go through this system. And if it wasn't good enough for my children and any children I loved or cared about, how could it possibly be good enough for the 500,000 children who are in it? And so that's not okay. And there's some things that you just can't unknow. And so even though I was perfectly situated, doing a job I was really good at, that mattered, worrying about nuclear terrorism, that I'd been doing for decades, and I was a busy mother of 3 young children, and so it's great to have a job you're already really good at in that point in your life. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. And over time, I took about 6 years to kind of learn more about why the system was the way it was, and why no one seemed to be doing anything about it, and why there couldn't be a cutting edge technology to help social workers who did know something to do about it to do that thing faster. And that's where Lisa comes in. Somehow I got introduced to Lisa, and we talked on the phone, and she said, why don't you come on down to the DC Rotary? This was like 7-8 years ago. I am, as it happens, going to speak on my experience in the DC foster care system this coming up Wednesday or whatever. And I said, sure. And I've only recently told Lisa this, but this was before I had launched Connect Our Kids. I came down to hear her speak because I found her story terrifying. I had read a little bit about her. She's written her story in a book. I highly recommend it, Being Too Fierce. It's incredible, very transparent journey through her experience, and it helped me to understand a little bit more about what this was like. And I decided I needed to meet Lisa Cohen so she could talk me out of doing this crazy thing. Because I didn't want to do it, because if you have, if you're making a really good living and you have 3 little kids and you're very busy and everything is kind of okay, why would you quit your job and start a nonprofit in a field you know little about, doing a thing you've never done before, build software, working with people who don't want what you have to offer? So it seemed like maybe I should not do it. But I couldn't find a reason not to do it, because the whole time, these 500,000 kids never got a say. They're effectively trapped in this system. And all the people who are keeping them there purposefully or unpurposefully, I haven't really met any evil people. There's not a focus enemy in this system. The problem is the system is the enemy. And the people working in the system are sometimes just as trapped as the children in it. But the children and their families have little to no say in what happens in terms of moving the system forward. So I came down to meet Lisa so she could tell me what a stupid idea this was, and how I just did not understand what I was talking about, and that I should really just go back to what I knew and leave this system to the people who lived it, who experienced it, who were trained in it. And then I would have my answer, and I could rest assured that whatever I had to offer wasn't needed. And Lisa failed. She was a complete failure that day. Never forgiven her. She said some version I laid out after the DC meeting. We met a little bit longer and kind of laid out my idea. And I waited for her to tell me how stupid it was and how I didn't know anything about it because I hadn't experienced it. and that I should really just, take my nuclear marbles and go home. And she said, after listening to me talking, she said, I don't know whether your idea will help or not, but what I do know is no one else seems to be doing anything about this. And your idea seems like it could be helpful. So therefore you must do it. I said, damn it. I said that to myself. Because if Lisa Cohen tells you must do something, now you're kind of stuck because she's a boxer. So that was a big push that really sealed the path forward. I had also met my co-founder along the way, a woman named Jessica Stern. She also experienced the child welfare system as a child in Ohio. And together we decided that we had verified that nothing existed like what we were talking about. Nothing was in the works. There was no one else we could join to just sort of help them. And we decided that if there was going to be an intelligence level connectivity data management software with smart technology to search the web for emails and phone numbers and relatives and who does Facebook think this person knows? Well, we should call them. What is their phone number? If there was going to be a system like that to then take that information, suck it in, visually map it and make it available to any of the social workers on the team who needed it, we would have to build it ourselves. So we quit our jobs 7 years ago and we did that. And it's been a long journey, but our software now helps social workers quickly find emails, phone numbers, physical addresses, find known associates of a person that they already have the information for so they can build out that map, help them track and call the outreach that they have made. If you don't know this already, the turnover in the social work field is tremendous. In some areas, it's as high and sometimes even higher than 100% per year. So you have an entire team changing over every year. You can imagine the loss of data and the discontinuity and the slowdown and the inefficiencies associated with that. What our software does is holds everything in logical places with highlighting, color coding stuff so that a team that's moving out or a social worker that's moving out puts their data there and the next person comes in and can see very quickly where they're picking up and continue to serve those children. We piloted in 2020 along with a small other thing that happened that year. And we had a few weeks of terror in which I thought that my last 10 years of my life was about to go down the drain because we had just launched 8 of 9 pilot sites when everything shut down for COVID. And I thought, what is going to happen? And what happened was, it turns out, when you're stuck at home and you can't go anywhere and you can't visit children in their homes and you can't go to court and sit half the day waiting for the 10 minutes in front of the judge, what you can do is you can use the internet to search for people that child knows or that knows that child. Thank you. So we had 50 social workers that we had kind of browbeaten into being part of the pilot. Once COVID shut everything down, we had people calling us back and saying, can I change my answer about being in that pilot? And we ended up deciding that we would open a beta to anyone who said the software could help them help children and families during the pandemic. So we went from 50 users around March of 2020 to 1,000 by the end of the year. So that was kind of a busy and exciting year for us. We've continued then, and I'll tell you a couple stories about what this software does. One of our favorite stories comes out of Ohio. Ohio gave us some funding to help build the software. It's a young woman we call Tammy. We protect the privacy of course, all the children and youth that are served. So we call her Tammy. She was pregnant, 20 years old and pregnant. In Ohio, you can stay in foster care until 21. So she was about to turn 21, age out of the foster care system, and she would go most likely to a homeless shelter with her baby. Tammy came from a dissolved adoption. So the foster care system didn't even know her biological family because they had removed her from an adoptive family. So they had no one to go back to start building out this tree. Tammy's coach had her take a DNA test. And as you know, if any of you have taken those DNA tests from 23andMe or Ancestry, they give you names, but knowing that Mary Jones is an aunt doesn't help you a whole lot if you want to talk to Mary. But they were able to take that data that came from the Ancestry.com DNA test, enter that information with some geographical guesses. So Mary's probably in the Ohio Midwestern area, enter that information. And by the end of that afternoon, they had an email address for Aunt Mary, who turned out to be in Indiana. And Tammy sent off an email to her Aunt Mary, hoping maybe Mary would respond. Mary responded within 30 minutes. And she said, I took the DNA test, hoping you would find me. Because Mary was the only person who knew Tammy had been born, except for her own mother. Mary was Tammy's mother's sister, had been a big secret. She was pregnant, had this baby, gave it up for adoption. Mary had been wondering what happened to that baby. So they got on the phone and explained the situation, explained that Tammy was living outside of Cleveland, had been living there spent most of her childhood in foster care after being removed for abuse from the adoptive family, and that she was about to age out without support and she was about to have a child. And Mary said, Tammy, you've been growing up with relatives all around you. Outside of Cleveland, they had dozens of family members living in that Cleveland area. And so within a week, there were about a half dozen biological family members in Tammy's small apartment offering support, gift cards, diapers, and their presence. And they also offered Tammy something that's invaluable. They told her why they hadn't been there, why she'd been alone, because they didn't know. They hadn't chosen to abandon her. They hadn't chosen not to support her. They hadn't chosen to leave her alone. They hadn't known. No one had ever, in the almost 18 years Tammy had been without a parent, a permanent parent in foster care, no one had reached out to the biological relatives that were living in the same small town because the social workers didn't know and they didn't have any tools to help them do it. So Tammy got connected to her biological family. I'll give you one other story and then I'll stop. All right, I get going. I talk all afternoon. We have lots of these stories. So, some of them are a little much, but they're important. So another story that's a little different that we also really appreciate is a story about a boy named Calvin who was in Oregon. His social worker was one of our first users. And Calvin was 17. His social worker knew that he would be aging out soon at 18 in Oregon. And she was really worried about that because Calvin didn't have anyone in his life who wasn't paid to be there. His foster family was a good and caring family, but they were not able or willing to adopt him. And he didn't have anyone else. Calvin also had no contact with his biological family. And because of that, he had created a story to explain this to himself. And if you can imagine being 17 and having no remembered childhood experience with anyone you're related to, he'd never had a visit, a phone call, a birthday card, an email from anyone he was related to. And so there's a vacuum there in your mind, and he filled that vacuum with an explanation that he made himself because no one had told him why. And the explanation he had created was that he'd been thrown away. Because why else would no one want to have any contact with him whatsoever? He'd clearly, in his mind, been such an awful baby, toddler, that they had gotten rid of him and closed that door. So you can imagine what life's going to be like if that's the story you have for your existence. Calvin's social worker got a hold of our software early on because she was worried about him and the story that he had for himself. And she very quickly found his paternal grandmother. It wasn't hard. She called up the grandmother, and the grandmother was beyond thrilled to hear from the social worker because Calvin had been lost. When kids go into foster care, this is starting to change now somewhat in some places, but when Calvin went into foster care, this was common. If you, as a family member of Calvin, if you were his cousin or his uncle, if you are not actively pursuing placement and being vetted and background checked, you are no different in your relationship with Calvin that the state will allow than a random stranger off the street. And so you have no allowed contact because the state views this as a way to keep Calvin safe. Yeah. So it's a misunderstanding of the term safe. Of course, children need to be kept physically safe. They also need to be mentally and emotionally safe. And that involves knowing their people, having connections, know who they are, what their story is. But that's not part of what the foster care system is set up to do. So Calvin had gone into a black hole as far as his grandmother and his other relatives had been concerned. His grandmother loved him so much that she still had his toddler pictures on her wall because that's the last she had of him. And she hoped that someday she would get contact with him again. So that day had come. And Calvin got to meet his grandmother and an aunt who had also kept pictures and kept hoping that they would be back in contact. Calvin not only learned that they cared for him deeply, that they had not thrown him away, that they had hoped that someday they would be reconnected with him. He also learned that he was in fact so valued as a baby that he was given the most important name the family had to give. It was the name of a great-grandfather, the grandmother's own father, who had been a family hero. He had been a local law enforcement officer. He had been one of the most esteemed members that family had ever had. And so Calvin had been named for that great-grandfather. And you can imagine the change in Calvin's story that this created. His grandmother and his aunt still were not in a position economically or physically to take his physical care on, to have him live with them, to care for them directly. He stayed in the foster placement. And that was a good foster placement. But he now has a whole different outlook on life. He has a whole different story for himself. He has an esteemed hero that he was named for to view as his mentor, his guide. And that's going to result in a whole different life trajectory for Calvin. So those are a couple examples of what our software does, how it's used, and the kind of story that we at Connect Our Kids view should be commonplace, not extraordinary. If a child has to be removed from their biological parents, and that those biological parents are not able to raise the child for whatever reason, after being given support and the effort to help them keep the child in place, then every child should have that level of outreach, that level of effort, and that level of coming around them and their family to give them a story, to give them a path, and to give them supporters, mentors, and their people. This is particularly relevant for children and families of color who are removed at greatly disproportional rates to their existence in the general population. Black children are removed at twice the rate of their general population. Indian, Native American children are removed in some states at up to 20 times their rate of the general population. It's crucially important. Any child needs to be with their people or needs to at least know their people. Adoptions by non-related people can often be a wonderful and loving solution. We are not saying that those are not good and kind. And if any of you are adoptive parents, I am sure that you are wonderful adoptive parents, and that was a wonderful solution for that child. What we are saying is that children who are going to age out of care without anyone, the 20,000 that I mentioned earlier, don't have that. They don't have a loving adoptive family. They don't have connection to caring biological family. They don't have mentors, coaches, teachers who are stepping up for them. One of our operational partners on the ground recently placed a teenage girl for adoption with her third grade basketball coach, because that's what she asked for. And when they called that basketball coach, can you imagine giving a call? I bet a lot of you, you're civic minded. You've probably coached kids' teams. You've volunteered at schools. He had coached a girls' basketball team of third grade girls. And 7 years had passed. And she had moved schools and counties and placements. And they couldn't find any family that could take her, even though they had tried. And they said to her, if you could live with anyone you wanted, who would it be? And she said, my third grade basketball coach. And I said, okay. Strange thing for a 16-year-old girl to say, but hey, what was his name? I don't know. It was Coach Mark. Coach Mark. But because they had the record, she's been in care, they were able to trace back, where did she go to school in third grade? Ask around. Who coached? Was there a guy named Mark? Coached the team. Yep. Mark Smith. Type it into our software. Mark Smith and his wife, Jane, live nearby. Call him up. Hey. Did you coach girls basketball 7 years ago? You remember a girl named Abby? Yeah, I remember Abby. She was a really neat kid. Liked her a lot. She's in foster care. She doesn't have anyone. She's living 2 counties over. But we asked her who mattered to her, who she looked up to, who she wanted as a parent. And she said, you. What? Can you imagine getting a call like that? You thought you were just out there talking about not staying in the box and all the stuff I just learned because my son just played basketball. What's the box? You thought you were teaching how to dribble and how to not get fouled or how to foul on purpose. Turns out that's a thing too. And what you were really doing is you were teaching Abby that you cared, that she mattered. And that came across somehow in what you did. Holy cow, you're amazing. And Abby remembered and noticed and carried that with her for years. It sustained her to the extent that when she needed to speak up for herself, to ask for a parent, she asked for you. I've never gotten a call like that. So Mark said, let me talk to my wife. And within a few weeks, Abby was moving into their home. And they petitioned for placement for adoption. And they're adopting her. So all kinds of different solutions are appropriate for all kinds of different situations. And we don't know what the right answer is. But what we know is the wrong answer is children being sent into adulthood with no one and living their childhoods not knowing who they are, who their people are, or why no one is claiming them. I can't imagine what it's like to live unclaimed. So that's what we do. What we're doing now is we're trying to get this software out there. The software itself is free. We do have to sustain our nonprofit, so we offer the opportunity for subscriptions to help with training and help with guidance and integration of processes. But if a social worker cannot or their agency chooses not to pay for any of it, it is still free. It is available. because we do not want the cost of software to interfere with a child being connected with their family. Through the grants that we have been given in the past, we're able to build the software such that we can offer it at no cost, and such that all we have to charge for are some extremely accessible rates for whatever works for the agency. And if nothing works, it's still free. If any of you have connections that I should know, we'd love to get into the DC system and have a conversation with them. If you have other connections or other ways that you'd like to support, or if you'd just like to know more about it, or if you'd like to read more stories like the ones I shared on our website, you can read those. We have many stories like that in our blog. This isn't our hardest problem. I'm a nuclear counterterrorism person. We have problems that should be harder than getting kids connected to their people. There's a lot of very hard problems there, and human problems are the hardest ones. But getting them connected should not be so hard. It's the work beyond that that requires a skilled and healthy social worker. And we need to shift their job from searching for people to doing that work to heal trauma and keep families connected. Thank you.
This is the question and answer portion. Jennifer, I'm sure people out there have questions for you. So if you'd be so kind.
It's an incredible work what you do.
Thank you.
Fundamental, bring the peace in the world. What is in a practical sense that you like to have us help? For instance, from us.
So we need a couple things. We need connections to folks who are senior enough in child welfare systems to make decisions. We need connections to, for example, local lawmakers, local councilmen, those who can influence and ask questions. Why are our children not receiving better support? Commonly, the child welfare system tells funders and legislators that they just, it's just too hard. We can't do any better. And that's not true. And it's not so much their fault. They don't realize how poorly they've been resourced. So any connections in that sense, we do always need funding. So if there's any direction towards foundations that you're aware of that are interested in serving neglected children, we'd love to talk to them if this is something that aligns with their mission. That we like to talk to foundations who like to talk to us. So this is something that can be really cool to fund for those who are the right people. And if you have any others who are just interested, we love to get the word out to the general population. Most people don't understand foster care very well, as I did not before. So send them to our website. And if you would like to make a donation yourself, we always take those as well. Thank you.
We had a question on Zoom about privacy issues with tracking down connections. For minors.
Yeah. So this is a question we get a lot. Security and privacy are some of the key issues that we keep in mind as we build the software. Our software developer has built his reputation in security, in the security space, and ensuring that we've built that in from the beginning. We are currently going through an external privacy and security certification process so that we can have that kind of stamp of confidence. But we already are very confident that we have that built in. We host this on Google Cloud Platform, which was carefully selected because of its federal, for those of you who know the terminology, FedRAMP High. So it's the federal assessment of the security of the platform itself, that data is encrypted in transit and at rest. And our software only searches publicly available data. So after all that security, the fact is that the data that our software finds is already in the public domain. Thank you.
Quick, fast question. Is your software open source?
No.
Okay. And the second is, I was struck sort of in a difference between the first story you told, in which I have 150 or 600 or 200 or however many people to search, and the stories that you told in which you had basically one connection you end up finding via DNA test, via a direct shot to this person. Do you also have stories in which you somehow blanket, 150 people that get sent out, and then one of those random people who you wouldn't have known, you just take the chances and the probabilities 150 times finally play in your favor?
So just to be clear, we ourselves don't handle cases. So it's always the social workers. Our stories come from them. And yes, so for example, in Abby's story with the basketball coach, they had gone through hundreds of others before they sort of in desperation said to Abby, like, we're striking out. It's not that your family doesn't care, but nobody was local enough, and just kind of they were being supportive but not able to take placement. And so in that case, they went to Abby herself and asked the question. Does that answer your question? It just kind of comes all kinds of ways. The two stories I told, I also simplified. It wasn't just the first person that they found. There was a little bit of work there, but it's not as hard as it's often not that hard.
Hi, Dr. Jacobs. I've never had gnocchi and cried in the same hour. So to start there, but my question is, you spoke about this dichotomy where the intelligence community basically has the software that you've built. And I think you've implied that kids that were able to find their people, they have much better outcomes. And I'm curious if there's ever been a tie between how, when kids find stability, their long-term outcome, both for themselves, their community, for the nation, is benefited. And if that has ever had a tie back to the intelligence community that is endeavoring to keep society stable and keep our nation safe.
Yeah, you're drawing a really interesting thread across fields, which the government does not like to do. The short answer is no, that hasn't been drawn. There are studies, not great ones yet, indicating that children do better when they're placed with people they have some connection to, generally speaking, for all the reasons you can imagine. But the data currently is fairly sparse, but the studies that have been done show children they develop fewer problems. They move fewer times. They get rejected less often from the home. Because if it's your third cousin, even if you just met them, you feel a tie. If you can think about it, we are, by definition, the descendants of those early humans who best protected their own. That's why we're here today. Those whose brains were not wired to protect their clan died, so they don't have descendants. That means that our brains are evolutionarily wired to react differently. If I tell you a member of your clan is in danger, your brain reacts to that. There's danger to my clan, that's a danger to me, danger to my group. We have to protect ourselves. And that's why family cares about family. Because in early days, without your family, without your clan, you will die. Humans are the most defenseless creatures on the planet. And the reason we more or less rule the planet, if you think that's the case, is because we work together and we protect each other, and we do that in families. So that I find is a fascinating approach. It doesn't quite answer your question, but I'll give you different information since I don't have what you want.
Great presentation. I just wonder if you could comment a little bit about situation at the border. Some kids in some places, they were instructed not to give them water. And I understand all these issues. I grew up in a foster home. I was there when I went there when I was 10, left when I was 15. So that's one thing, but the thing that doesn't, I also work for the intelligence community, service them. But when not giving human beings water, how does that happen? Can you talk about that at all?
I can't speak to that in any better way than you can. I can't imagine how that could be acceptable. I can speak a little bit to the separation or in the unaccompanied treatment of unaccompanied minors at the border. Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services operates what's essentially a federal foster care system. And children who come across the border unaccompanied or become unaccompanied through the actions at the border more or less go into federal foster care. And there's all kinds of tragedies there that seem reprehensible just as a citizen, as a human. But I don't have any direct influence there. We have offered our services to the federal government, spoken to a number of folks in HHS. We get kind of a general positive reaction without any follow-up. So if anyone has connections there that we should know, we are the process of handling children at the border. They go through 5 different data systems between INS, CBP, a couple other offices that are less well known, and eventually making themselves to the foster care system in HHS. And between those data systems, they lose data. It takes weeks to process. They end up shipped all over the country. The fact is that 80% of kids who come across the border unaccompanied come across with a phone number in their hand of who they're supposed to go to. CBP feels that they should do some vetting, and that seems somewhat appropriate. There was a case of the phone number belonging to a trafficker, and so they don't want that to happen again, and that's appropriate. But it takes months, and usually the phone number turns out to be their uncle or their cousin, and they're supposed to go to live with them in Chicago. And there's no reason that has to take months. We could do that very quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs, and my dear friend. Thank you so much. We have a tradition that for every speaker who speaks at our club, we plant a tree in your honor, and we would like to plant a tree in your honor. Here's the certificate, and we have